I feel like I would be remiss and pretty irresponsible if I didn't take just a few minutes to actually talk about some of these absolutely horrifying discoveries that have been made surrounding former residential schools, former Indian residential schools here in Canada. So over the past few weeks, there have been two separate stories that have broken. In one case, they found the remains of more than 200 people who are believed to, if not be exclusively, at least mostly, Indigenous children that would have been attendees at these schools in unmarked graves. And then there was a more recent one that is more horrifying still, because the number attached to that one is 750. Now, one thing that they know at this point is that they do have this many human bodies buried in unmarked graves. One thing that we haven't really found out yet is whether or not all of them are Indigenous children. I don't know if I feel any better about this if it turns out that they're not all Indigenous children, that perhaps other people are also in these graves. And the other important bit of information that is not yet in the public domain just yet is who made the decision to remove the markings that were on at least some of these graves, and when was that decision made? In particular, as I have been informed, the graves in Saskatchewan, the 750, at a certain point apparently there had been gravestones present to mark all of those graves, and at some point they were taken away. So the question of who took them away and why they took them away is a question that I think that we do all need the answers to. But here's something that I think is poorly understood about this story, that I think that everybody does need to understand, is that really, for people who have always known about this particular story, and apparently it turns out that not everybody did, not nearly as many people as I thought so, because I actually have had people my age ask me recently, what is a residential school? It's not as common as I thought that this knowledge really was. I was taught about this in school, and apparently a lot of other people weren't. But for those who have known about this for pretty much their entire lives, and I've known about this for close to my entire life, the one thing that we always knew is that there had been a lot of deaths in these schools. How the deaths came to happen, there is a matter of some controversy there. There are details about the way that it happened, that aren't widely known and aren't widely appreciated. But the simple fact of the matter is that we have always known that there were thousands upon thousands of deaths in these schools. What we're learning now, depending on how these stones came to be removed, but what we're coming to see now is not only the fact that there were these many deaths, but the amount of disrespect that was shown at some stage, regardless of when, regardless of by who, but at a certain stage, there was an absolutely horrifying lack of respect shown for these human remains. And there's a lot to be said there. I know that a lot of people would say that there could never have been this level of disrespect if we weren't talking about Indigenous children. That could be true. I think that if we were to discover that they are in fact exclusively Indigenous children in these graves, which we're not going to know until the investigations are complete, and if that turns out to be the case, that would be a very, very, very compelling argument that would be very difficult to disagree with. The majority of these deaths are believed to be from diseases that swept through these schools when they were overpopulated. The students were being kept, too many students in one particular dormitory, too close together, and so things like tuberculosis, like smallpox, spread through these places like wildfire. The students were underfed, poorly clothed, let's just say that the shelter situation, was not up to a standard that the government had legislated on. But a lot of the various organizations, many of them churches, that were running these schools, they looked at these students not as children put into their care that they were responsible for. They looked at them as a source of revenue. And so the per head fee that the government would pay them, to look after the education of these children, to house, feed, and clothe them, a lot of those things, they were diverted away from those things and basically into either building new church buildings, building new properties, or maintaining the existing ones. So basically, corruption and greed. And of course, I think the natural question to come to mind at that point is, could the school inspectors have actually been bought off and bribed the way that they were if you weren't talking about Indigenous children? If you were to tell me not likely, I agree. And so make no mistake about this. Racism is a huge driving factor in what caused the deaths of these children. The one that we tend to overlook are simple greed and political corruption. The churches in particular that were involved in running these schools, they have a lot to answer for. Because it's simply this: it is within the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not steal. And for those churches that did take money that was given to them by the government to pay for, as I aforementioned, the feeding, housing, clothing of these children, instead turned it to their own purposes, that's theft. That's theft. There is a commandment against that. And so, another thing that's been going on, of course, is the vandalism of churches, the burning of churches in BC. I believe that's actually 5 to date. I don't support any of that, but quite frankly, there does need to be a reckoning from these churches. And in particular, the Pope, he put out a statement basically pitching this back to the Canadian government and saying that, oh no, it's on you and we don't really bear any responsibility. That's bullshit. The Office of the Papacy needs to make an apology for what happened in these schools, and in particular, these last schools that have been discovered were both run by the Catholic Church. And while, quite frankly, some parish in Saskatoon that had their cathedral vandalized, various churches in BC that were burned down, were not parishes that ever operated a residential school, or at least definitely didn't operate these ones in particular. And so I don't really support this kind of thing, but the simple fact of the matter is that the parishes that did run these churches all operated under the authority of the papacy. So they can't just shrug their shoulders and think that they're going to walk away from this. The Office of the Pope had a responsibility to make sure that the guidance in place for these churches was better than they would be doing something like breaking a commandment. Like, that's a damn basic. And from the people who are responsible for this, there is no excuse that I will accept for the deaths of these children, and there is absolutely nothing that you can say to get yourself off the hook.